Good morning. This is going to be the fifth lecture for the last testing period in History 2303. We want to talk about the transitional 1960s and 1970s today. You know, Texas politics, relatively simple in the post-World War II years, became very complex in the 1960s, given the political aspirations of Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas. In 1960, his U.S. Senate race was much closer than the governor's race in the state of Texas. Governor Price Daniel Sr. was reelected with little opposition. But in the United States Senate race in 1960, Lyndon Baines Johnson ran against Midwestern University political science professor, Republican John Tower. This was Tower's first race in Texas. It wouldn't be his last. Johnson's vote of 1,306,000 votes was sufficient to win re-election, but Tower pulled in over 900,000 votes. Tower's strength came from Texans opposing Lyndon Johnson's dual election races, the fact that he could run as Vice President of the United States and still keep his Senate seat, and the fact that Tower was a strong opponent of oil and gas regulation meant that the oil and gas industry in Texas rallied behind this new political newcomer, Republican John Tower, a political science professor at Midwestern University in Wichita Falls. LBJ campaigned vigorously for the 1960 Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States. He traveled 30,000 miles. He relied on his political prestige and the support of U.S. Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, to assist him in other states of the Union. LBJ emphasized his political, personal knowledge and talent and his achievements as the Senate Majority Leader because they were impressive. And he noted the relative inexperience of his chief opponent, Senator John Fitzgerald Kennedy of Massachusetts. Unlike the little accomplished but very charismatic John Fitzgerald Kennedy, LBJ was not inspiring as a candidate in 1960. At the 1960 Democratic National Convention, JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, quickly wrapped up a first ballot victory, but understanding that as a Northern liberal, he couldn't possibly be elected without the support of the South and the West. Kennedy, in turn, offered Lyndon Baines Johnson the vice presidential nomination of the Democratic Party. Lyndon was a consummate Democrat, and he now accepted the role of playing second fiddle nationally to a man who until recently was in the Senate and was politically inferior to him. So when Lyndon accepted the vice presidency of the United States, or at least the vice presidential nomination of the Democrats, he did a role reversal. While a Senate Majority Leader, he was clearly the boss of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. But if Kennedy would be elected in 1960, as eventually he would, then John Kennedy would become the boss and Lyndon would become the second round as Vice President of the United States. Many conservative Texans were disgruntled with the very strong civil rights plank in the 1960 Democratic platform, and many Northern and Eastern liberals honestly didn't trust Lyndon Baines Johnson. So Texas Democrats were soft in their support for the Democratic ticket because Texas Democrats, conservatives basically, feared the liberal John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Texas Republicans rallied around Vice President Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's Vice President of the United States, and his vice presidential nominee, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge III of Massachusetts. And they were assisted by an organization called Democrats for Nixon, organized by none other than former Governor Alan Shivers of Texas. With both parties believing Texas 24 electoral votes critical to gaining the presidency. Both parties campaigned vigorously for the loyalty of an apparently evenly divided Texas electorate. Conservative Texans were concerned with Kennedy's Catholicism, and liberal Democrats questioned LBJ's support for liberalism. LBJ's efforts, and in South Texas, what were called Viva Kennedy clubs, carried Texas by 45,907 votes out of 2,200,000 votes cast in Texas. In other words, it was very close. In truth, the 1960 election in Texas hinged on South Texas voter irregularities, as similar irregularities would soon come out of Chicago Mayor Richard Daley's Democratic political machine. Nixon supporters believed that Texas and Illinois Democrats had stolen the election from Vice President Richard Nixon. The truth is that in South Texas, with the Parr brothers supporting Lyndon Johnson, South Texas was going to go Democratic, whether it was a legitimate vote or not. Republican John Tower's strong showing, despite Nixon Lodge loss in Texas in 1960, encouraged Texas Republicans and opened the door to victory in the state-mandated 1961 special election for the United States Senate seat, now vacated by the new Vice President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson had been re-elected in 1960, but he was also elected or was running on the ticket as Vice President of the United States, so he had to give up one or the other, and he gave up his United States Senate seat. In 1961, in an election to replace Lyndon Johnson, 11 candidates filed with liberal Democrats, generally supporting either Henry B. Gonzalez of San Antonio, Jim Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, of Fort Worth, or Maury Maverick of San Antonio. Conservative Democrats primarily supported William Blakely, while Republicans backed their man, John Tower, seeking the Senate election from Texas as United States Senator. In a runoff election in August, William Blakely came out first among the 11 candidates in the May primary, and John Tower came in second place, surprising second place. With all other Democrats supporting William Blakely, allegedly, in the runoff election in August, liberal Democrats decided that they were going to boycott the election or support John Tower in an effort to force the Democrats in the future to nominate less conservative and more moderate Democrat candidates in Texas. And in 1961, as a result of DOT, Democrats of Texas, liberals, boycotting the election or the runoff, or either supporting John Tower won the Senate seat from Texas, becoming the first Republican to represent Texas in the United States Senate since Reconstruction. And that gave the Texas Republican Party credibility statewide and nationally. In 1962, Texas Republicans gained a second United States congressman seat as a result of an election in Dallas, and several more state house seats, including 6 from conservative Dallas. The very conservative middle-class values of the Republicans became increasingly attractive to Texans in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The Texas Democratic Party was fractured along conservative versus liberal lines. The conservatives were led by Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the liberals were led by United States Senator Ralph Yarborough. In the 1962 gubernatorial election, the race for Texas governor, the split within the Texas Democratic Party was obvious. Liberal Democrats supported Don Yarborough, a Houston attorney who was not related to United States Senator Ralph Yarborough, but Liberal Democrats supported Don Yarborough of Houston, a Houston attorney, with Governor Price Daniel seeking a fourth term of office. United States Secretary of the Navy John Conley, closely identified since his days in college with Lyndon Baines Johnson, resigned as Secretary of the Navy, came back to Texas, and threw his hat into the ring for the Democratic nod as gubernatorial nominee in 1962, promising the appointment of black executives to garner Texas Democratic black support. Conley defeated Don Yarborough in an August runoff and then beat Republican Jack Cox, a former Democrat, in November of 1962 to win the governorship of Texas. But Republican Cox polled 46% of the 1962 governor's vote in Texas. By mid to late 1963, Texas Republicans looked forward to the 1964 presidential election, particularly since the National Republican Party was moving to the more conservative right, opposing the civil rights movement and big government. So it seemed that the National Republican Party was moving in the very conservative direction that would attract many Texas voters. Since many Texans viewed John Fitzgerald Kennedy as a liberal, he could be beaten by a conservative Republican. The GOP, the Grand Old Party, the Republicans in Texas, united firmly behind ultra-conservative Republican United States Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona in 1964. To heal the rift in the Democratic Party of Texas and to reassure John Fitzgerald Kennedy's re-election in 1964, Kennedy traveled to Texas in November of 1963. He realized that the only reason that he got elected in 1960 was because he had Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas on the ticket, which would help him in the conservative South, even though he was a liberal. And John Fitzgerald Kennedy, by November of 1963, was looking forward to the election of 1964, hoping that he could get reelected, and he realized that Texas was pivotal to his reelection. And with liberal Democrats versus conservative Democrats split within Texas, the door was open to the Republican Party in Texas to win Texas and deny John Fitzgerald Kennedy a re-election in 1964. So that's why John Kennedy came to Texas in November of 1963. John Kennedy flew in to Houston, Texas on the 21st of November, 1962. He traveled to Fort Worth, spent the night in Fort Worth, and then got up early the morning of November the 22nd, 1963, and he motorcaded from Fort Worth into Dallas. And it was when his motorcade was traveling through Dealey Plaza that Lee Harvey Oswald, allegedly a single gunman, shot and killed John Fitzgerald Kennedy and seriously wounded Governor John Conley. One of the two shots that hit President Kennedy went through the back of John Conley, exited his chest. He was in a sitting position in the car, in the seat behind the in front of the President of the United States. So the bullet that went through Kennedy's neck also entered the back of Governor Conley. It exited his chest. It bounced off a thigh and ricocheted over and into the other leg. And so it severely wounded John Conley. But the two shots were mortal to John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Within 2 hours of John Fitzgerald Kennedy's death, Federal District Judge Sarah Hughes of Dallas, Texas, a friend of Lyndon Johnson's, swore Lyndon Baines Johnson in as President of the United States in a private ceremony aboard Air Force One at Love Field. It was John Kennedy, John Kennedy was dead, and Lyndon Johnson was sworn in for security reasons aboard Air Force One at Love Field in Dallas. Of course, the question remains, who killed John Fitzgerald Kennedy? And we could spend an enormous amount of time talking about the conspiracy theorists who say that there was a second gunman on the grassy knoll. But the truth is that that there have been a number of books written that have suggested that, for instance, John Kennedy's administration had attempted on about 10 different occasions to assassinate Fidel Castro of Cuba. And the very day that John Kennedy was shot in Dealey Plaza, a rifle was being delivered to a Cuban dissident for another attempt on Castro's life. And one has to wonder if Castro finally had come to the conclusion that if he didn't kill President Kennedy, that President Kennedy was eventually going to have him assassinated. There are those who believe that the CIA, the intelligence agencies, actually did away with President Kennedy. Sorry. Why? Because John Fitzgerald Kennedy was a womanizer. He had friends, lady friends in the White House during the time when he was married. One of his mistresses was a lady by the name of Judith Exner, and Judith Exner was the girlfriend of a mob boss, the mob boss of New Orleans, Louisiana. Carlos Giancana, I believe, was the mob boss's name. And the President of the United States and a mafia boss, was sharing the bed of a lady common to both of them. And that was an embarrassment. And the intelligence community had been essentially sacked after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And John Fitzgerald Kennedy didn't trust the intelligence community. There's another reason that perhaps the intelligence community decided to do away with President Kennedy. He and his brother, the Attorney General of the United States, were having a torrid affair, sometimes in a, forgive the term, a three-way affair with Marilyn Monroe. If you've ever seen Marilyn Monroe sing Happy Birthday to John Fitzgerald Kennedy in the White House, it is sung so seductively that it leaves nothing to doubt what Marilyn Monroe was intending to give the President of the United States on the eve of his birthday in the White House. Both Bobby and Kennedy and John Kennedy were having a torrid affair, sometimes in a relationship with Marilyn Monroe at the same time, and maybe the intelligence community killed President Kennedy. But the very best theory that I have always enjoyed was one set forth by a British author. And this British author said that President Kennedy was assassinated by the KGB, the Russian secret police. And the story was that Lee Harvey Oswald had, in the 1900 and late 50s, had eventually decided that he didn't want to live in democracy anymore. He had moved to the Soviet Union and taken up temporary residence, where he married Marina Oswald, who ultimately became his widow. It was said that the KGB was unhappy with John Fitzgerald Kennedy after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that the KGB had assassinated Lee Harvey Oswald and replaced Oswald with an agent who, over years, had had a series of facial altering operations, and that this agent, who was really a KGB spy, an agent, was then returned to America with the intent to kill John Fitzgerald Kennedy. This British author said that the evidence that he had was that Lee Harvey Oswald was a 6 foot tall, to the very inch, 6 feet tall man. But the British author said that the agent who had replaced Oswald and had undergone all those facial alterations was really 6 feet 1 inches tall. And the British author said after the death of Lee Harvey Oswald, Oswald was killed the following day after John Kennedy by Jack Ruby as he was transferred from the city jail to a county facility. And he was shot to death. Oswald was buried in a Dallas cemetery. His widow put up a stone over his grave, and someone stole the stone. She replaced it, and someone beat the stone with a sledgehammer, and people began to carry off his headstone. So for a number of years, Marina, Lee Harvey Oswald's wife and widow, simply had her husband buried in a Dallas cemetery without a gravestone, without a marker. Authorities knew where he was buried, but without permission of the widow, authorities could not open the coffin, exhume the body, and measure the body to determine whether the body in Lee Harvey Oswald's grave was 6 feet or 6 feet 1 inches tall. But after a number of years, Marina Oswald finally succumbed, and she allowed the Dallas coroner's office in the middle of the night to go out, and in the middle of the night they dug up the body of Lee Harvey Oswald. They exhumed it from its grave, and Dallas coroners stretched out a tape, and the corpse in the coffin of Lee Harvey Oswald was exactly 6 feet 0 inches. And I've been told that the British author never sold another copy of his multi-million-dollar bestseller because his thesis was refuted because the corpse was exactly 6 feet 0 inches, not 6'1". And so that disproved the British author's thesis. The simple truth of the matter is that the Warren Commission, established by Lyndon Baines Johnson to determine who and what and why John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated, looked over all of those conspiracy theories, and they came to the conclusion that John Fitzgerald Kennedy was killed by one man, Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald had been a Marine sharpshooter while he was in the military services of the United States, and in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination, sharpshooters from every branch of the service were brought to a facility that was built to emulate the 6th story of the book depository building in Dallas, where allegedly Lee Harvey Oswald had fired his rifle twice at President John Fitzgerald Kennedy within about a 15-second period. And only about 40% of sharpshooters in the military could hit a moving target, moving about 10 or 15 miles an hour, and hit a target twice within about 15 seconds. But the truth is, it could be done. It was done by some of the sharpshooters, and Lee Harvey Oswald had held a sharpshooter's marksman's rank as a Marine when he was in the service of the United States. And so the Warren Commission came to the conclusion that one disgruntled expatriate, Lee Harvey Oswald, killed John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And to this day, that is the best conclusion. I end this discussion of Lee Harvey Oswald with evidence that came up about 15 years ago. We didn't have lasers until about 15, 20 years ago. And laser technology was finally used by a bunch of Canadians who went to Dallas, Texas. And using lasers go on a straight line, as a bullet does, and they set up lasers all over Dealey Plaza. And it was determined that the book depository building, specifically the window on the 6th floor of the book depository building where Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly fired his weapon from, was one of 2 potential sites. The other site was a building behind and even further away from the president, from the than the book depository building was. But there was no angle of inclination for a second gunman on the grassy knoll. At this point, I want to stop, and I will see you around campus, and I'll see you in the clouds because someone is at my door. Bye.